Hey, ladies and gentlemen, I'm John McCulloch, an advisor in life sciences here at MaRS. I'd like to welcome you today to the MaRS Best Practices session entitled Avoiding Pitfalls in the Regulatory Path. Today we will have a talk from Dr. Sonia Sanhueza, who's advisor and practice lead in life sciences and healthcare here at MaRS. Sonia advises entrepreneurs who are working to commercialize medical devices, therapeutics and healthcare information technologies. She's experienced with the entire life cycle of healthcare startups, from early stage research to taking products to market. Sonia has led the research, development and regulatory strategy and global plans for vaccines and products in the areas of regenerative medicine, cell therapy, pharmaceuticals and medical devices. So without further ado, Sonia.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much for coming to this session. We'll start here with what we're going to be discussing today. I want to give you a little bit of my experience, what I have collected over the years working in different industry of biologics, pharmaceutical, and medical devices, and which are the challenges that you encounter as you move product forward. So the first is we're going to be talking a little bit about the product life cycle for both pharmaceutical and medical devices. I want to give you a very high level information about the requirements from a regulatory viewpoint and quality requirements. I'm not going to be citing information that is already on the website of the FDA or Health Canada, because that is copy and paste, and for that you can access the website and all the links. There is a lot of information there on the FDA, the same as with the European Medicine Agency. Also, I would like to address some of the common pitfalls and the consequences. Pitfalls that go into different areas as you move the product forward. Then what do you have to do to avoid those, which are the homework that a lot of us sometimes try to avoid or cut corners, but the consequences after that are very drastic. I'm going to be showing you some of the warning letters in the different areas, including investigators, hospitals, and medical device and pharmaceutical, and provide you with just a summary of the discussion. So let's go to the product life cycle of drug, biotech, biologics. One of the messages that I would like to convey to you today is start with the end in mind. If you have a product, think about what are you going to put on the label, which is going to be the claim, because that will define your regulatory path. So in the product life cycle of biotech or drugs or biologics, you have first the concept. Then you have to prove that concept in a R&D setup, in a research setup. By when I was a researcher, so I used to do everything in a small scale, my little tubes and cell culture or synthesized peptides. So you do everything in a small scale. And as you move forward, you start doing your evaluation in different animal models appropriate to what you're developing, your drug or your biotech product. You do different type of animal testing or in vitro assays where you prove in a little bit larger scale your product. Then you start doing your clinical studies, and that encompasses phase 1, 2, 3 clinical studies. Sometimes you do phase 2A, 2B, until you collect information enough that you can submit it to the agencies and get approval. Mind you that in order for you to do a clinical study, obviously you need to get approval from the local regulatory agency, being either in Canada, Health Canada, or in the US FDA, or any other jurisdiction like in Europe, the member state. And then you collect the money if the product is approved when you commercialize and develop distributorship partnership agreements. Through how all of these processes, starting with after you get the proof of concept, because you don't know if it's going to be, your idea need to be tested in order to know if it's going to work, you are going to be having some quality and regulatory requirements that we will see throughout the presentation. And at the bottom, I put it, the International Conference on Harmonization. This is an organization that was established many years ago, and it tried to harmonize standards through how the key jurisdictions, which are Japan, US, and Europe. Canada attend the meetings, the conference, and participate in some of the workshop, but doesn't have the right to vote, the same as Switzerland. And it covers from the development of the good clinical practices, protocols, investigator brochure template, adverse events, what is an adverse event, pharmacovigilance, etc. So it covers a broad range of standards or requirements in order to be able to develop a product that can be approvable in the different jurisdictions. For medical devices, I will touch a little bit later, but the path is shorter, but depends of the medical device that you develop. The classification of the medical devices in the three main jurisdictions is based on risk. So you will have class 1, 2, 3, and 4 in Canada, class 1, 2, 3 in the US, and in Europe is class 1, 2A, 2B, and 3. Europe and Canada are very similar in terms of the requirements. US use what is called a predicate, so that there is something in the market that is similar to what you have, and use it to submit the 510K that is called a submission, or when you are developing a more invasive, riskier device, you have to submit, do quite a lot of clinical evaluation in the with human for evaluating the safety and the performance of your device, and you submit PMA, pre-market authorization. So, we have the drugs, biotech, and biologics, and as I indicated before, you have your concept and you do a proof of concept. All of that in a small scale in the research environment. And then you come to a go, no-go decision. If the product is a go, you have to start thinking about how I am going to be developing that product. And this is a little bit of a challenge, because in many instances, there is not that in-depth understanding of what you need to do. You start thinking about your raw material. Well, before I used to get my raw materials from Sigma. And it was, I got it and it was not a problem when you were in research. But sometimes you look at the label that Sigma chemicals have, it says for R&D use only. What does it mean? It means that those reagents, the source of those reagents for the purification and preparation of those reagents can come from any country. That the process can be changed without you being told by Sigma or any other of those that manufacture that type of reagents. So when you are manufacturing something for the purpose of putting it into human, you need to have a raw material that is controlled. The source is controlled, because if there is anything that change in that raw material could have an effect on the product that you are using, impurities, interference in binding to a resin, if you're purifying through different HPLC processes, or if you're doing a cell culture, it can inhibit the growth of the cells. So you need to control your raw material, the source. You need to qualify the suppliers. Sometimes, how do you qualify them? Well, you have to have a criteria. You have to have documentation. When you are in research, you say, why do I have all of this, so much documentation? Well, because you need to have traceability. You need to trace from where things are coming. You can't have any more sticky notes. You have to have a document that is controlled at the end of the day and signed off by you, dated, and co-signed by the person that is supervising the study. So exist those type of notebooks. Reference standard. You're purifying something, you're synthesizing something, but you need to know how are you comparing to something else. So you have to have a reference standard in order to be able to compare in the lab. Processes, procedure, personnel. When you are in a small company, it's difficult to have funding. So you always think, well, I'm going to just hire this guy. He's very good, he's very enthusiastic. I'm going to train him or her as we go. So you start cutting corners. So you don't hire a qualified, educated, experienced individual to perform something that is critical for you, because sometimes you don't have the funds. And you have to be careful on that. Somebody might be very enthusiastic, but as newly graduate, you are very enthusiastic, you want to learn, but you don't have the experience. And sometimes when you are ready to manufacture something for phase 1 clinical trial, it's important that everything is well controlled. The facility and documentation. Now, small, middle-sized enterprises don't have the amount of resources or the facility to carry out preclinical testing. So you outsource. So you hire a contract research organization. How do you know that they are a good one? How do you know that they control their documentation appropriately? It happened to me many years ago. I was leading a global project, and we had to send samples to the US for testing. Everything was very well controlled. However, and we were ready to go into the clinic in a couple of months. It happened that the results from one of the tests came positive for an adventitious agent that it was detrimental to have in the sample. So I obviously panicked because we were all exposed and working on that. The company had been audited where we were doing the testing. So we stopped everything. We dumped all of the material, and we carried out an extensive investigation internal. It turned out, and then we went back and re-audited the site. It turned out that one of the workers was new in that facility and took a pipette from one lab to the other one where he was testing our sample and contaminated with that adventitious agent the sample. So the results came positive. So in fact, it was negative. So it can happen even if you are very thorough, you test, you analyze, you audit. So be aware about which is the criteria. You gotta be very careful and keep an eye always on the contract manufacturing, contract research organizations. You follow GLP, good laboratory practices, mainly when you do the preclinical testing. And you do GDP, good documentation practices. Who's going to control the documents? Who's going to store the documents? Where are they going to store? Do you have a fireproof cabinet to store the documents? Are easily traceable, the information? When you go and review protocols for animal testing and you're going to start writing your protocol for clinical analysis, which are the versions that you have? You suddenly start reviewing version 2.1.1 and your colleague is reviewing 3.2, and you're like, I'm wasting my time because I'm reviewing something that was already a new version came. So have a way of controlling the version of your documents. And the GMP, good manufacturing practices. When you are developing biotech products, pharmaceutical products, the good manufacturing practices are necessary. You have to be up to date with the changes of how do you manufacture and how do you test, which are the specifications of the test, how do you come up to those. There is a rationale and the controls in the facility, the airflow, the pressure that you have. As you move into the clinical stage, it becomes a little bit more work, more outside work, because you have to contract the investigators. So you make an agreement, you sign an agreement with an investigator. There was a couple of years ago a very well-known case of an investigator that sued the company here in Toronto. It was in the news. And because there was a perception that the company, the product that the company was moving forward in for approval had some adverse effect on the patients. So how is the agreement with the investigator? They need to be signed. It needs to be very clearly stated which is the role. The principal investigator is responsible to oversee and supervise any of the personnel that is there. The clinical research organization that is going to be performing the clinical data management, the collection of all of the data, need to have a good control process. The database need to be qualified because so that nobody there change any of the data. The has to be the process for manufacturing has to be validated. And again, audits need to be performed. So the quality and regulatory requirements, to me, are common sense, are things that you have to do. It's like when you're going to buy a house, you need to know where you want to live, right? And if it's close from your work, or it's going to be far, if there is any way to take a bus, a GO train, the car, the highway. So you have to do some homework. The same when you manufacture a product. You need to know how are you going to test that product? What do you need to do? So you need to have clear roles of the management team. Who's going to be doing what? So that there are no assumptions. The expectations are clear. At the moment when you have the clinical studies, in some cases, is not common that for phase 1 you're going to have the FDA at the doorsteps of your facility. But it could happen. So how are you preparing for that event? How much do you know about being audited? In some cases, in the facility, you have an operator that is performing a test. And it has an SOP beside them in order to follow the protocol. The FDA officer would be standing beside that individual and look it over the shoulder with a copy of the SOP and see if the person is doing that. And you will see later that there are cases in which the operator have no clue about the SOP, but is doing according to the way he was or she was trained a couple of months ago by somebody else, and the training records are inexistent. So, as I listed here, I'm not going to go through all of them, but you need to know that when you develop a product, there are some controls that are basic. So ask yourself, how I'm going to go through all of this process. Do I have a notebook? Where I'm going to put that away? Who is going to do the work? And which type of work? And how I'm going to be testing. When we talk about at the early stages, when in a small company, when you are thinking about the proof of concept, in research you come out with a name of your chemical, your drug, your biotech product, and you usually call it whatever elution from the column was, like RPC 1-2.5 or -A, and you carry that, a couple of other testing that you do, but you're not going to sell with that name outside. And when you start having interaction with other potential partners, you would like to have a good name for the product. So the first thing that you do is you brainstorm in your group and says, what is a good name? Would it be good, Autosim or what product would be, right? So your legal group or you contact outside your legal support will go through the trademark and will find out if there is anybody else in their database that has a similar name. However, the trademark office is not the only checkpoint for pharmaceutical products. In most cases, here list the process. You have the name, you brainstorm, you send it to the legal, they search that database, and they came up that saying, it's clear, nobody else has that name. You are ready to go, but you're not ready to go because you have to also be aware that from a regulatory viewpoint, you have to make sure that there is no similarity with other products. Because when it is on the shelf or when it is issued by a physician, that product, it shouldn't be confusing to the individual to buy that versus another one that is helping hypertension or any other illness. So you have to check the Orange Book, which is a list of all the products approved by the FDA. There is the US adopted name, which is the generic drug names there, so they don't like to have it very similar to your generic name. And include information like phonetic and orthographic, and also the Health Canada. I'm not going to go through this. I try to put everything here, not for you to read, but for you to be aware that there are different type of names that you eventually, in a pharmaceutical environment, have to get familiar with. And when you prepare the final submission, you put those names in the dossier, being the INN, International Non-Proprietary Name, and the generic name, the common name, and obviously the brand name, which is the name that you're going to commercialize your product. So the trade name is something else that you need to be aware, and then regulatory inspection that could happen at the moment of the agency being reviewing your dossier for approval of the initiation of a clinical study. So they will be coming to your site, your facility, and see, how are you doing? Show me your documents. Show me your data. How is the facility? Let me walk through that. When you have the agency come, you usually prepare yourself who is going to be saying what. You try not to say much. unless you are asked, and you say just, you answer that, or you say, I'll get back to you, right? So you talk to somebody more senior, so in order to respond. You don't offer any more than what you need to offer because you know they're coming for one specific product. But you're so enthusiastic with all the other things that you're developing that sometimes you tend to talk and tell the story. And usually as part of the training, when you have FDA coming, you have a room where you have all the information and you train the team to be ready and with coding, all the preclinical information, all the CMC. There was a best series practice last week, was it, on CMC. So it's something that you need to be aware, the control, all the chemical information. So you need to be aware of where is it stored and why did you come to that decision of using that specific sample to go into the clinic. So there is a lot of homework that needs to be done, a lot of the planification. So the common pitfalls. I have been made aware of situations where FDA comes and is ready to be audited at the site, and we are informed that they are coming next week on Wednesday, and you have a week to get ready, and suddenly you start collecting all of the SOPs, and you find out that the SOPs are in draft form, haven't been signed off, and some of them are missing. It does happen. So how did you justify that? So make sure that all your documentation is in one place. Somebody was trained, but there is not a record of the person being trained. So you can promise, I trained the person, but there is no record. And the FDA says, if it is not written, it doesn't exist. And it's true. Facilities, you would be cleaning the facility. You cannot clean it with any detergent. It has to be specific because the detergent can be detrimental to your product. You have to have the appropriate system, ventilation system, so if it is positive pressure or negative pressure in the area where you're working. Who enters, there is a process in the pharmaceutical industry for entering the facilities. You enter on one side, personnel, and you exit the other side. The same for the raw materials and equipment. So not everybody just go ahead and enter. There is a process for doing that. Testing procedures, acceptance criteria. You are using that test, I don't know, it looks like it worked well, so I'm using it. So how do you make the decision of using that test within that range? How robust is your test? How sensitive? Who else has done it? If this technician does the test, but it doesn't work with this other technician. So it's not very robust. The results are not documented. I have the results, but I didn't put them in the notebook. But I'm sure I wrote it somewhere. And you have in your desk a lot of sticky notes and printout, but you don't know if the printout corresponds to that result. So make sure that you are organized. And again, we talked about the raw material earlier. In terms of the clinical, for conducting a clinical trial, there has been many cases. You would be surprised of investigators enrolling patients outside of their eligibility criteria. So how will you be able to evaluate the data if you are combining individuals that are not qualified to be part of that clinical study? You have to have clear understanding of the statistics. so that you don't make conclusions based on 3 patients, but the data need to be statistically significant. Some fail to obtain informed consent. You know, when you go to the hospital and you need to have surgery, there is one page that the patient has to agree that is going to have that surgery done. Well, in a clinical setup, all those individuals that are going to be included in that study need to sign a consent form. And in some cases are not appropriate the way the subjects or the patients agree in signing. You need to make sure that the language that you use is clear, because from a scientific and clinical point of view, you can be talking at a very high level and very specific. But it needs to be translated to the common population so that they can understand the risk, the consequences of entering into that clinical study. The customer complaints, you're already having your product being used for research purposes only, for example. However, those customers, those users, have some complaints that it causes them stomach pain, or in the clinical trial also. Now, how do you capture that information? You have to have a clear understanding of based on your preclinical data, on your in vitro testing, and all of that, you are accumulating a lot of that information. So you're expected to have the taking actions based on something, scientific information. Now, with the medical devices, as I said before, it depends of the classification of the medical device, how stringent the process is going to be from a regulatory and quality viewpoint. So if it is a class 4 in Canada, or class 3 in the US, or 3 in Europe, you will have to perform clinical studies. You need to validate your medical device in the clinical setup. You need to demonstrate that it works for the target population that you are going to be using it. If it is a class 2, class 1 you will just list it, but if it is a class 2, you might not need to do clinical studies, but you need to collect clinical data, publish clinical data. Now, be aware that sometimes your clinical data, you say there is a lot of information, but the conditions under which those individuals have been tested or evaluated with something similar to what you have might be completely different. So you may be having to extrapolate too much to the point that the regulatory agency will tell you, well, you cannot apply that because it's too far. The conditions, the environment, the age group that in which this was evaluated is completely different to your target group. So be aware also that different jurisdictions have different requirements. Some of them have very specific local requirements. The validation, the medical device process here, the medical device process involves the design planning. You have a medical device and you're going to design what it's going to look like. So you have a lot of input data, and you developed, and then you test, and that is going to be the output data. You go through the process of planning, and then you need to verify it. And if it doesn't work, it goes back to the planning process, and you start again, design input, design output. make sure that all of that information is appropriately recorded. It needs to be reviewed. It needs to be approved. You cannot just change everything without having appropriate controls, without capturing how is that going to be. So you have to have a change control process. And then it goes to the design transfer. You're doing in the research setup a lot of the input and output, and then you say, you know what, it's working under the conditions that we are developing, and now we are going to transfer that to the manufacturer or to the developer. And how is that going to be transferred? So there has to be a checklist, because the fellows in this other side are going to say, well, it doesn't work for me. And then you say, well, you are not doing it the way I told you to do. Have everything in writing. Have everything clear, which are the specifications, which is the criteria. And when you move it from the R&D side to the testing and later validation, you need, similarly to what we talk in the pharmaceutical, you need protocols, you need processes, procedures, SOPs, documentation, storing documentation in the appropriate place in a fireproof cabinet, and the facility and, again, supplier qualification is very much, the bases are the same. It's common sense, but you have to do it. In the medical environments, from a regulatory viewpoint, you have the quality system. So the quality system requirement, QSR, is a way of managing the process, and that includes facilities, resources, and the product. In the resources are very stringent in terms of how the responsibility of the executive team, how quality is perceived, and how much you bend the rules, basically. Because sometimes when you do a lot of the quality, it's a lot of documentation and back and forth that you have to really write SOPs for every single thing. And then you become tired. It's like, can we just have somebody else to sign for me? I don't have the time. Well, it's listed here that your role and your responsibility is this. So you have to make the time to review and agree on what is going to be used. So there are policies and procedures and documentation under the QSR that need to be performed. So also ISO 13485 is how the manufacturing facility that is going to be used to manufacture a medical device for human use will be maintained, which is similar to the GMP, how is going to be the flow of medical device, of the equipment, resources, and personnel, and how that is going to be working in the whole process of production. As we move forward in the validation, obviously you're going to need protocols, reports. The validation is a key aspect, and it's a very time-consuming aspect of medical devices, as well as of the clinical trials for pharmaceuticals. For medical devices, you validate if you have a software, you have to validate the software for what it is being developed, and then the whole medical device you have to validate in the clinic for in the target population that you are trying to use it. Usually when you have an audit, before having an audit by an inspection by the regulatory agency, you usually try to have a third group do your assessment. How is your facility? Do you have the documentation? So you don't find big surprises when the FDA come to your doorstep or any other agency. So you do a gap analysis. And it's very important to be very clear about the expectations. So in your gap analysis, it will look into the system, the processes, documentation, etc. You can also have a full or partial internal audit. You should be doing, medical devices companies should be doing internal audits periodically. And also be aware that under the quality system, performance review, one of the objectives in your personal objectives should be a quality objective. And the company should have a quality objective as part of the overall plan goals for the year, strategic planning. I'm not going to go through all of this. I put it this one so that you are aware that the responsibilities of the management, the different planning stages, and how you evaluate the performance of the company has a big role in all the quality system and ISO 13485 requirements for medical devices. One of the key issues in doing the inspections or questioning from the agencies is what is called CAPA, which is the corrective action, preventive action. So you found a problem, you're trying to solve it, but you want to avoid of this happening again. So how detailed you go is important. A lot of companies, they do a quick and dirty. Okay, never mind, we're going to maintain happy the agencies, the regulators when they come, the inspector, we're doing it. Or you respond to an FDA warning letter in a very general way. Well, the FDA doesn't like that. They want to have a detail so that it never happen again. Because what they are trying to do is to protect the population, the patients. There are procedures are not in place for the evaluation of the device design requirements, and documents control. So it's the same story, no matter if you are in pharma, biotech, medical devices. The bottom line is that documentation is critical. Means of the documents, traceability is critical. How you move forward with the process. If you don't have a process, you don't know where you are going. How do you maintain information about the suppliers? How do you qualify the suppliers? Who is providing you with the basic material to manufacture your medical device? Is very important. That there are clear contracts. There is a lot of sourcing from India and China. And it has to be very clear that raw material manufactured no matter where need to follow the GMP or quality system procedures so that they are very well controlled. And as I said before, for R&D purpose only chemicals, they can change the manufacturing process provided that at the end there is just the same chemical. But if you're going to use that one for human use, the supplier needs to tell you that they are going to be changing the manufacturing process. And you have to agree if they are going to change it. If you disagree, they can't change it. Because that is going to be for human use, because you have developed your process based on certain characteristics and specifications. So they can't be changing because they have come to an agreement that raw material is going to be supplied with a specific profile that doesn't impact the final product. Device history record for each batch, lot, and unit are not maintained. Device history record, basically you are going to be manufacturing this device and you have a batch. you manufacture all of these medical devices, and all of that is in this document, where sometimes it's in many places, sometimes it's in a drawer, and you left it somewhere else, and you wrote the labeling information in another binder. You had to have, and that's why it is called, you have the device history file, you have the device master record, so that in the master record all the procedures that are used for manufacturing the product are maintained. In the device history file is the history of that medical device. Companies implement changes before performing identification, documentation, validation, verification. It's very common that you're under a lot of pressure by investors to start your clinical study, to have the submission, because that is going to have more value. You're under a lot of pressure by different board members because you want to move, because you promised that this was going to be at the end of quarter 2, and you're starting quarter 3 and you have not done yet that goal. So you want to just implement before you go through the process, which is sometimes can be tedious process, but you have to do it because people need to take responsibility and be accountable for signing and agree that that new process is going to take place. And the FDA really look after how is your process for change control. Other aspect that FDA and all the regulatory agencies are very strict is about risk. How do you qualify risk? And there is a whole methodology, and our experts that are able to evaluate the risk of the medical device containing certain type of components. There are or leachables from plastic, or that produce certain type of allergy in individuals that are sensitive to different components. So it's very important that risk is analyzed, and what are you as a manufacturer, as a sponsor, as a responsible individual are ameliorating the risk. What have you done? And there is a whole way of qualifying risk based on different standards and quantitated the risk. So that that's for another seminar, a very good evaluation of the risk of your medical devices or your pharma products. The role of social media in regulated companies. I'm so happy with this product that I want to tell everybody. I'm going to post it on the website. Well, be aware that you have to have also responsibility for how you promote your product on the web. The agencies, the main regulatory agencies don't have yet specific guidelines, but you have to be aware that how you promote, it can make people use it off-label, or and then you're going to start having complaints from customers. So it's a whole issue of how you promote for what and which target population. So to avoid that, it's important to have counsel from an expert that address product risk, consumer-generated discussion of off-label use, communication online. How do you capture the questions of the consumers? So it's good to promote your product, but be aware of having a clear process, how you're going to promote and for what. The team also that discuss about online communication is composed of different individuals with different background and expertise. It's the same as when you have a recall, it's not only the president of the company and the regulatory person, but is sales and marketing, manufacturing, quality control, quality assurance, regulatory, etc. So it's a different disciplines that take part of that discussion. With promotion, it's the same. You have your sales and marketing, business development, regulatory, in some cases quality person, because it's need in the regulatory individual need to make sure that you are not promoting outside of the claim. As I mentioned before, guidelines are not yet specific, but there are some position papers and white papers on that. So, consequences and impact. You didn't have the protocols, the FDA came, Health Canada came and audited and inspected, the notified bodies came from Europe, and they had some challenges for you. So what happens? You're wasting time now in order to fix the problem, and time is money. Your credibility is being damaged because you promised that everything was okay. Well, it wasn't okay. And then you were planning to be in the market at a certain time and have a competitive advantage. Well, now you're going to be delayed because you had to fix the problem, submit the information to the FDA or to Health Canada or to the member state where you are submitting the clinical study or the license application, and they will have to review it. So all of that takes time. So the consequences, if it is the FDA, it will could close you down, could have injunctions, you would have to pay, as you will see in some of the examples. Sometimes you have to pay large sum of money. And you had to respond in 15 days, business days, so it's working days. But the time flies. 3 weeks is not a lot of time when you don't have your house in order, when you don't have your documentation, and you have to say, you had to have corrective actions and preventive actions. So how are you going to do all of that in such a short period of time? And what happens is that all of that was done with a contract manufacturer, right? And it was their fault. No, it's your fault. You take responsibility as the sponsor, not the contract manufacturer, not the contract research organization to do the clinical study. The FDA can refuse if you are doing that. You are part of a global company and you are doing that in another outside of the US, for example, and you want to continue importing product, you will be refused by the FDA until you have your house in order. And that doesn't mean that you finish there. You have to make sure that all the other products related with your facility have also the same, don't have the same problem or have good standards. So I'm going to go a little bit on the US FDA warning letters as examples. Basically, a Form 483 is issued by an FDA officer after they inspect your facility and they find that there are some challenges with your product, your facility. And those are posted. So your competitors will know about that. And you don't like that. And they will have all the details of the problems that the FDA encountered. So the field inspector will submit the final 483 to the superiors, and they will issue a FDA warning letter. So you must respond quickly. It's not advisable to start arguing back and finding tons of justification, because you had a chance when you had the inspection, and at the end of the day, after the inspection is done, there is a debrief where the FDA lists all of the issues, and you have a chance of explaining as well as during the inspection time. So you need to provide a clear response. You have to give a timeline for how you are going to complete the actions You can't just leave it in the air. You say, well, I promise, I will do it. You have to say, well, this is going to be done in this way, by this person, by this time. In some cases, the FDA says, okay, I would like to have a follow-up. Depends on the seriousness of the problem. And be available to answer any questions and respond quickly. So, sorry for the small letters, but this shows about a clinical investigator that carried out a clinical study, and he was quoted as, it appeared that there has been some previous interaction with the FDA and the clinical investigator. He was supposed to say, yes, I was responsible, I took responsibility for carrying out this study, and I trained well the people that I was supervising. But it didn't happen that way. He started arguing back and stated that he had, he was going to do better supervision, but the FDA wasn't pleased with that response. And they said that he enrolled subjects that were outside of the criteria for the eligibility criteria. He didn't have a way of documenting the information. The documents for capturing all of the information was not available. And then they stated that you were not given any guidance or clarification from the sponsor, and it's your responsibility, basically. You sign a document that you were going to be responsible, and now you say that the sponsor didn't give you the guidance. Well, it's your problem. So they said that any of the data that is collected now from the study is questionable, would not be a strong data. Validity would be an issue. The response, it wasn't found to be adequate, and they failed to provide the details so that there was not a corrective action and preventive action. And he had 15 days to respond. Now, there is a blacklist of investigators, as you might know, of those investigators that keep making mistakes, and the FDA doesn't like that, and they put them in a blacklist, so you would not like to. So usually when you are exposed to do studies with different groups, depends on the therapy that you're developing, you look at a list of investigators and you make sure that they are not in the blacklist, so that they have not been cited by the FDA throughout the inspections. This other one is about CGMP. This is Sanofi Aventis in Germany. And what they did was to do a microbiological test. Thank you for coming. A microbiological test where the procedures was not clear. They also had a problem with a personnel that was doing the test but was not following the SOP. And I'm sure that somebody was standing beside the employee. And they said that they were going to be having drastic consequences, such as any other application that they would be submitting, they would not be reviewing it. Any other product that they would like to import into the US will not be accepted until they clear all of that and they provide to them within 15 working days or business day a response very detailed. In terms of the medical devices, they had, in this case, procedures for implementing. As I mentioned before, sometimes the companies are in such a rush to implement that they don't follow the procedures and they implement before it is approved. So that was the case here, and they didn't have the appropriate controls, and the design history record was inadequate, so they were not capturing information about the batches, about the lots, about the label. Again, here follows with the device master record, not following procedure, not having controls. All what I have been mentioning to you, I try to capture in these warning letters, because these are facts, these are real companies that are having problems. And these problems could have been avoided. And here is going to be an injunction. They will have to pay penalties. They will hold again applications for a class 3, so it's a more invasive medical device. And it will not be approved if they don't submit a detailed, clear, committed response within the 15 days. Again, here is a specification, risk, validation, intended use, a similar problem. Sorry. This is a hospital post-approval inspection. So in this hospital, there was a mammogram, a medical device, and it was not clean. They were not following the procedures. So the FDA said, because this is not being followed, you will have to pay $10,000 for every procedures that you perform. And we need to have it within 15 days a response with a clear guidance and detailed guidance on how you're going to perform all of the mammograms. In summary, start with the end in mind, which is going to be your claim, and work backward. Plan for the future, because that will allow you to be prepared for what is coming. Get expertise when the regulatory guidance documents are there, but you need to interpret them. And you need to be interpreted by somebody with experience in that field, because you might misinterpret that information. You might either be doing more than what you need or less than what you need, most likely less. And it will save you money at the end. And failure to do so can result in poor product quality, time, money, and people will not trust the company, and it will take, a lot of time to build up trust. Key element to have in place: processes, procedures, documents, control, training, education. So they are basic requirements. And thank you very much. Do you have any questions? Any questions?
This presentation, is it available online? Because I could not capture all the notes.
It will be, yeah, it will be posted
Okay.
online.
So when you said changes, do they mean software tweaks that people do? Like say, you have a product which relies upon software internally, and then you figure out, okay, she's going up to 9, and probably I should just try to go to 10 or do 10 iterations or something.
There are that type of changes. There has been some adultery of information.
Okay. So then each change has to go through the change control board and all that process.
That's correct. Because all of that is traceability. In other words, when you decide this is it, this is my product, and you move it forward, which version is that one? You need to make sure that the software was the last one, the hardware was the last one, or the prototype was that one, so that rather than the previous version, and then you are going to be generating data with the right one, not with the previous ones. So basically it's traceability.
So I can do whatever I need to do to get up till the release point when I say this is my release 1.0, and from that point on I have to track everything.
No, before that, you have at the early stages of research, when you have design input and design output, right? Mm-hmm. Then you need to know, okay, I'm changing. It doesn't go into so much detail at the beginning because obviously you have quite a lot of parameters to look into. But it will come a moment in which you decide, okay, is almost version 5 of your product. Mm-hmm. And then you want to make sure that you're going to be testing that one. You need to control that. Anything that goes in and comes out need to be verified.
Okay. So one of the things that in the technology world we have been using is many developers would comment in line, like they would comment in the drawing itself instead of creating a separate document or in the source code itself. So that's not acceptable, right?
You can do that. You can compile all of that information, print it, and have it in your documentation.
Okay.
So it's not lost. Why? Because you don't have a control database where you're capturing all of that information. Anybody can change it. But if it is hard copy and it is saved appropriately, captured, stored appropriately, nobody will be changing it. So you will be responsible, for example, to make sure that none of that data is changed. Because you want to make sure that any of the comments, somebody's implementing those comments, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the point.
Okay.
Yeah?
So can use of documentation control or electronic programs to hold copies of those things, that's acceptable. I don't have to have a physical room holding all those files.
It would be best if you print them, that information.
I'm trying to avoid printing, but okay, so printing is preferred.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Because if your computer, if there is any glitches in the computer process or communication, you want to make sure that it's still there. And I strongly advise to have a small fireproof cabinet where you store your paper.
Okay. Because I can always take a snapshot as a PDF and save it somewhere and make it secure. Not everybody can access it, but it is on some kind of.
I have it a backup.
I have a question about the medical devices. You mentioned that if you're class 1 or 2, you may not have to do a clinical study as long as you can find published literature to back up what you're trying to prove your device can do. But that sometimes the literature may not be sufficient to do to show what you want to show.
Right.
So how do you determine in that situation whether you have enough data that's out there to support yourself, or if you truly do need to go and do a study for yourself?
In some cases, it's useful to summarize the information, look at what you want, right, and what you have, and do a gap analysis. And then once you do that gap analysis, you said, okay, which are the critical elements? How critical are those that I don't have, and how that is going to impact my product development?
Right. And is it possible to, once you do that gap analysis, to say, okay, what's out there covers this portion, but this is what we're missing?
Right.
If you design your study to just focus on the things that are missing and you piece that together as a whole application to the FDA, will they accept that?
It could. I can't tell you without looking at that. I would really advise you to try to get somebody that can look into the picture, because it's a lot of assumptions.
Yeah.
Right? So how you bridge, it would depend on how critical those missing parts that you are bridging are for using the product in the clinical setup. And always think that it's better to do a little bit more than less, because if you have to repeat it, it's going to cost you more. And FDA, for example, is very open to consulting, so that it could be that you summarize all of that information, very brief, and you request, can I have a call? CDRH is very open.
Okay.
So that means I can plan my protocol with them as well. I said we can have preliminary meetings with them to determine what path we'll be following.
You can have discussions with the FDA, but in that case, if it is a little bit more, that there will be some information prepackaged that you will need to put together, like protocols and things like that, where they can provide you with input.
So is that information recorded and will become part of my subsequent approval?
Yeah, everything, they will not approve. There are different type of meetings with the FDA, which are for medical devices, agreement meetings, and that depends on the stage of the development that you are at. But every meeting with the FDA is capturing minutes. So it's recorded.
Right. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Thank you.
very much.